Well, in commenting on Ellie's paper, you only need to remember how it was in school when you went to school and nobody mentioned November 2nd. But in commenting on Danny's papers, we have a whole gallery of experts on British politics, on Turkish politics, but we also have Professor Shlomo Avineri, who has helped to put together the conference and who will comment now on the papers before we can come out and ask the more urgent questions that you all have in preparation. Please, Shlomo.
Thank you very much. My comments will be basically footnotes on the two lectures. And if I may use a Christian analogy, lehavdil, I'll try to answer a marginal question. How did the word become flesh? In other words, how did the words of the Balfour Declaration become a political reality beyond a piece of paper? And let me start with some of the things which were said by Elie Podet. I think you mentioned and very clearly pointed out how plastic is historical memory and how it can be manipulated or changed politically. One minor comment. In the historical memory of the Zionist movement with all the ups and downs you mentioned, there was a very successful attempt to Judaize the dates, leyahed otam. We don't say Shnayim b'November, we say Bet b'November. We don't say 29 b'November, we say Kaftet b'November. There's a street, Kaftet b'November. It sort of internalized it into the Jewish Hebrew calendar, and this is of some significance. Second point, the Prime Minister's residence, which is called now Rehov Balfour, originally was a residence of the Foreign Minister, Sharet, and later Abba Eban. And the real address is not really Balfour, because the entrance is from Peretz Smolenskin. But who knows Peretz Smolenskin? It sounds also Russian. And Peretz Smolenskin is Kurat Chamor, we know that, that's a Hebrew joke. So it became later Habayit Rehov Balfour. This is really a modern tradition, which shows, again, the plasticity of it. But since you talked about commemoration, let me go back to what was perhaps the beginning of the commemoration. One of Weizmann's major achievements was not just the Balfour Declaration, but what happened later. Balfour was able to convince the British government in London, after the country, the south of the country, was occupied by General Allenby, to send a commission, a survey commission, to Palestine. It was called the Zionist Commission in the British documents. In the Hebrew documents, it's called Vadat Tzirim. It did not get a clear mandate from the British government, nor did it get a mandate from the Zionist organization, which was sitting in Copenhagen. I'll come back to it in a moment. Weizmann decided who are the members. And the members were, of course, this was still the middle of the war, only members of the Allied. So there were members from Great Britain, France, and Italy, something which was very non-representative of the Zionist movement, both in terms of membership and leadership before 1914. And when the commission, the Zionist commission, came to Palestine, which General Allenby didn't like, because it appeared that there is another semi-official group here, it behaved as if it is part of the new government, which it wasn't. And didn't get it wasn't yet clear. This was the summer of 1918. It wasn't yet clear at all whether Eretz Israel or Palestine would be part of, under British rule. But Weizmann managed to meet with the leaders of the Jewish community in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Rehovot, and it became a commemoration of the Zionist achievement with the Balfour Declaration. The fact that Weizmann and the Zionist Commission was accompanied by British Jewish officers, James Rothschild, Edwin Sumner, the son of Herbert Sumner, who later became High Commissioner, gave it an official status. Weizmann decided, without getting any permission from any Zionist organization, to lay the cornerstone for the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus, because there was an estate which was the property of the Zionist organization. And if you look at the photographs, and there are photographs, you see Weizmann and a number of people standing with a small stone, in Hebrew, al-har kereach, and this is creating the facts on the ground. And this was a great achievement of Weizmann, who was able to translate a Zionist survey commission into a semi-official group, which eventually organized what later became the elections for the first representative assembly, Asafat HaNivcharim, of Palestinian Jews. So one has to look at the Balfour Declaration not just in terms of memory, and at that time, I think you mentioned it, that was the first commemoration in Eretz Israel of the anniversary in November of 1918. So the transformation of a private letter, not even on the stationery of the Foreign Office. It says Foreign Office in typewriter. It's not the stationery of the Foreign Office. To translate a decision of the British cabinet, but was a private unilateral statement, into a reality of the Zionist Commission having some sort of presence in Palestine under a very temporary British military rule, was one of the achievements and led to the memory and the commemoration of the Balfour Declaration as something that has changed history, which certainly wasn't the way in which the British government, which saw it as a wartime movement, to which I'll come back in a moment. Let me now move to some of the aspects which were raised by Professor Goodwin. I think we don't understand sufficiently how tragic the outcome of World War I was for the Zionist movement. For the Jewish people, it's a much more complicated business. The Zionist movement, 1914, after the death of Herzl, survived, but as a small and marginal group, not really very successful in its political aims. And when the war broke out, it created a major crisis for the Zionist movement, because the leadership of the Zionist movement in 1914, because of Herzl and his successors, the leaders of the Zionist movement were basically either Viennese or German. The membership and the mass support, insofar as there was a mass support, was in Eastern Europe, in Russia, which included not only Russia proper, but of course Ukraine, Belarus, most of Poland, and Lithuania. And the war created a wall between the leadership in Germany and the membership in Eastern Europe. And the Zionist leadership decided rightly to move the headquarters and the activity in a war situation to a neutral country, and therefore it moved to Copenhagen and decided the Zionist organization movement is neutral in a war, which was understandable, but also catastrophic. And Weizmann, who was at that time a known person, but not a leader, we think today of Weizmann as the leader of the Zionist movement. He was not a leader of the Zionist movement. He was a chemist working in some obscurity in Manchester. He was one of the deputy presidents of the British Zionist Federation, not a major position, but he realized that if you are neutral in a war, which will decide the future of the world probably, especially after Turkey joins the war, and the future of Palestine, if you declare yourself neutral, you're neutralizing whatever impact the small Zionist movement had. And this is when he started, with some of his friends in Britain, to try to move towards contacts with the British government, which he was able through the Manchester Garden and his meetings with some British officials. The Aceton business helped him entree to some of the British war people, but to try to find out how you can get in touch with the British government, something which was criticized by the leadership in Copenhagen as getting the Zionist movement into trouble. And at the end of the day, Weizmann succeeded precisely because Britain in 1916 and 1917 was interested, especially after the torpedoing of the Lusitania to bring the United States into the war on the British side. And again, this is something which we today tend to forget, that there was great opposition in the United States to the United States entering a war. This is American isolationist history, not getting involved in European wars. But there were two groups in the United States which were, for political and historical and ethnic or religious reasons, opposed to America entering the war. One was the ethnic German group in the United States, which numbered at that time almost 20 million people and was very active and very visible. Later it disappeared because of the war. The German Bund. And they were against America joining a war against Germany, which they viewed as a historical, traditional, linguistic, and perhaps even political homeland in a way. And the other group were the Jews of the United States, who were politically not very well organized, certainly not powerful, but were against America joining the war, and again, for two complex reasons. The leadership of the American Jewish community at that time was mainly made up of the old money aristocracy of New York, which was basically of German background. And they had their contacts with their families in Germany or in Austria-Hungary, and there are also the linguistic contacts with Germany. And they felt very uncomfortable finding themselves in a war with a country with which they continued to maintain contacts. And the Jewish Amcha in the United States, the major groups, were 2 million Russian Jews who fled Tsarism and Russian anti-Semitism, and they had no feeling for getting into a war on the side of Russia and the Tsarist Russian anti-Semitic tradition. And one of the reasons, and this has been mentioned, but it has to be underlined, why there was a realpolitik reason for 1917 Balfour Declaration. Things were discussed earlier, but it didn't lead anywhere. But in 1917, it was a crucial year, was to try to have an impact on American Jewish public opinion. And the address was really much more, not world Jewry in an abstract sense, not the right of the Jews, but to minimize or neutralize the American Jewish opposition to entering America to war on the side of Britain and against Russia. And in the crucial meeting of the British cabinet on the 31st of October, 2 days before the declaration was decided upon, it was decided on the 31st of October, published on the 2nd of November, Balfour said that when we publish our decision, this will be very useful for our propaganda. The term propaganda at that time was still kosher, to our propaganda in Russia and in America, because most Jews in Russia and in America support the Jewish national aim. This is very clear. This is the words of Balfour. This is very clearly realpolitik at its best or at its worst, and Weizmann was the one who was able to utilize it. And the last comment has to do with a very significant internal debate and disagreement in the Zionist movement immediately after the war. Weizmann realized that, again, the Balfour Declaration is a very important document, but it's a private, unilateral piece of paper. And therefore, the fight for entering the Balfour Declaration principles into the British mandate, Ktav HaMandat. And here he had to fight against members of his own community and the Zionist organization, which started reorganizing itself after 1918. 2 points. One of the leaders, official leaders of the Zionist movement who was in the West, Nachum Sokolov, who was Russian, but he got stuck in the West and had some good contacts with France, tried to convince the French government to insist and the British government to agree that France should be the co-mandatory on Palestine, because Sokolov had some contacts with France. And Weizmann saw this as a major mistake, because A, Britain has a commitment to the Balfour Declaration, and France, on the other hand, has an interest in Lebanon, the Maronites, the Catholics. It has a very different agenda. And therefore, it was very important to try to influence, insofar as the Zionist movement could influence, that it will be Britain and not a condominium or co-mandated Britain-France. The other thing is that some members of the Zionist movement, Paul Zion, Jabotinsky, Zangwill, who came back to the Zionist movement after his territorialist exile, a very strange coalition, tried to convince the Zionist movement to insist in the League of Nations that the British mandate on Palestine will explicitly talk about the setting up of a Jewish state in Palestine. And Weizmann saw this as utterly nonsense. The mandate system that was meant to bring those mandatory territories towards independence, self-determination, Wilsonian principles. The League of Nations would not agree that 10% of Jews will be the rulers of 90% Arabs in British mandatory Palestine. And it was not easy for Weizmann to convince his colleagues that tafasta merubeh lo tafasta, this is too much. You're not going to get support for it. Just as, of course, in 1947, the Kaftet November decision was based on the acceptance of the of partition on the Zionist part. It is only after these moves, the Zionist Commission to Palestine, Weizmann's ability to make sure, as far as the Zionist organization is concerned, that Britain will be the sole mandatory power, and not insisting on a totally unrealistic claim for a Jewish state in Palestine rather than the nebulous language of national home, which is important but was still nebulous. It is only then that Weizmann became the leader of the Zionist organization. And it was only in the early 20s in London that he was elected president of the Zionist organization. And from a rather obscure, but relatively known, but obscure and not very powerful person sitting in Manchester, he became the leader of the Zionist organization through his activities. Not his position in the Zionist movement made him important for the Brits, but the fact that he was able to navigate the attempts towards the Balfour Declaration, the facts on the ground in Palestine, and later on the insistence on including the Balfour Declaration principles in the mandate on Palestine, made him the leader and moved the focus of the Zionist movement from Austro-Hungary defeated, Germany defeated, to Britain. To be able to understand in the nebulous situation of a war that you have to change track, that neutrality is not going to help, that you should be on the side of the victors and not on the side of the vanquished. Very realpolitik, very clear, but also very pragmatic about what can be achieved and what cannot be achieved. I think this was Weizmann's great moment. Later on, things went perhaps in a different direction, and not always did Weizmann realize that his time has, in the 30s and later 40s, really passed. But this move towards the leadership, in which the Balfour Declaration was a step towards Weizmann's own leadership in the Zionist movement, is, I think, one of the most important biographical elements which sometimes get lost in the myth which the Zionist movement naturally built around both Weizmann and the Balfour Declaration. Thank you very much.